Read with me. We're in Galatians chapter 1 today, but before we start, the title here is Paul Called by God. And for a bit of context, this text is part of a letter, or multiple, from the Apostle Paul to the church that he oversees in a place called Galatia, hence the title of the book, Galatians. And in this first chapter, after he greets them in a beautiful way, Paul always greets in a beautiful way, of course, he starts saying that he's a bit disappointed in them and how quickly the believers there have allowed themselves to become distracted from the faith. And some have even turned away from the gospel, sincerely just doubting it. And so after that, Paul goes on to detail his journey since becoming a Christian. And he urges them to believe that the gospel they've heard from him, that he has preached to them, is true. It's not some made-up story. No, it is very real. And he reminds the church that he's writing to of what he was like before he met God, about how passionate he was about persecuting Christians and about this sort of staunch version of religion. And he uses that almost as a resume and as a way to make a case for his integrity and to make a case for the truth of what he's saying and the truth of what he is teaching. Now, let's go to Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 14 to read what Paul ends up actually saying to the church. So verse 11, Paul says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and even tried to destroy it." And this is how passionate Paul was, because he says in verse 14, "And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." Funny, isn't it? How we see here so clearly that Paul's former life acts as an evangelistic tool that adds credibility to his message. I think about those ads for weight loss products or for fitness programs. You've probably seen them. What is used to sell the product or the service usually isn't the gradual improvements. It's not the person who wants to lose, 2 to 5 pounds or simply wants to become healthier or who wants to make health a part of their lifelong process and not just drop weight like that. Instead, the focus is almost always on these drastic changes. You usually see this, one person who's the before, somehow always with the worst lighting, right? And they complete the 30-day fitness program, and now they've lost a shocking amount of weight. And now they're over here smiling and flexing their muscles, and coincidentally, also always have better lighting around them, right? You've absolutely seen this. The drastic changes are usually what are used to sell the effectiveness of a thing. And we see Paul doing the same thing here. He reminds the church in Galatia of his reputation and of how before he would have never advocated for Christ. They all knew that. They knew his reputation. So for Paul to be the one to believe, that ought to be testimony enough. I've had a similar experience, actually. Well, a couple. But I remember having a conversation with my younger cousin about faith. And I answered his questions the best way that I could. He's an atheist. And so some of what he was saying or asking was a little antagonistic, but that's just who and how he is. I'm used to that. But in general, whenever I have conversations about faith with non-believers, I try to keep in mind that whatever question or retort they have, it is not directed at me. I feel like sometimes we can be so passionate about the Lord, but that also makes us very defensive when non-believers say that they disagree or that things don't make any sense, because faith doesn't make sense, right? It's a spiritual thing. But I also think that this defensiveness comes partly from our own pride, this unconscious belief that we are the ones who get to save people, and that if people speak ill about God, about our faith, or if people don't want to believe, that somehow damages our reputation, or that we'll have to come home and deal with a dejected and sad God if we don't stand up for him right now. As if God is a small child and he needs us to stand up to the bullies for him. Don't get me wrong, stand tall and stand strong for God. But God has been God a long time. And just like Paul, he has a reputation. And his reputation is that he can speak for himself and he can surely defend himself. Though people's unbelief and sin may sadden God, it doesn't stop him from being God. Even if people don't want to believe, or even if they mock God, we don't need to take that personal because it doesn't take anything away from God. His being will persist, no matter how often he is denied. So I really tried to keep a level head during the conversation with my cousin. And again, I just answered what I could. And when I didn't have an answer, I simply told him so. I told him, I'll look into it, or I'll consult with someone else, or simply, I don't know that we will ever have the answer to this question on this side of eternity. And I just left it at that. And he really appreciated that, by the way. He appreciated that at some point I would just say, you know what, that's a good question, but I don't know the answer either. And that's okay. Being a Christian doesn't mean that I need to know every single answer to every question. I myself am also someone who continues to seek God for answers. And I myself am also someone who continues to have to grapple with the fact that some things I will never know. But the most important thing is that I know for sure that I am so confident in this, that God is real and that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And that is my foundation. Anything else that God reveals on top of that is beautiful. But I'm learning more and more that it's okay to not know. That doesn't make me less of a Christian. It doesn't make me less believable or less credible in my faith. So after our conversation, I asked him why he wanted to know about my faith, because he hadn't asked me before. Or he had asked me sort of, but he'd always said, I don't believe in that. Never mind. I don't want to hear anything about this. And so I asked him, why now? Why take the time now to ask me these questions? And you know what he told me? He said, it's because you are one of the most intelligent and analytical humans I know. I really respect your mind, which I thought, thank you. But then he said, and because of that, it doesn't make sense to me that you believe. But I know that you feel very strongly about it. And so I asked you about it because I wanted to know why you specifically think this is true when it all seems so unlikely to me. You see, my cousin saw such a drastic contrast between my naturally analytical, rational mind, scientific mind, and my passion for God that it piqued his interest. And he became curious about my faith. Because if I believe, then surely there must be something to it. At least it's worth a conversation. So now let's go back to Galatians chapter 1. This time we'll read verses 22 to 24. And here Paul writes, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. And they glorified God because of me. So because of Paul's story, sometimes we think that our past beliefs, past convictions and behaviors disqualify us from preaching the gospel, from testifying of the Lord's goodness. Because our sin was so widespread and so well known, people know us this one way. And it makes us think that that weakens our position and that we can't turn over a new leaf, that people won't believe us. When in reality, it often really helps to show people our scars. It helps to talk about the depths that God brought us from. Because the contrast between the then and the now, when it's genuine, when it's real, and people can tell when it is, it actually strengthens our case for God. So does the gradual change, by the way. I really need to mention that. Because I'm thinking about how not long ago I had a conversation with a friend. Love a good conversation, right? I had a conversation with a friend who was also not a Christian. And she told me, you know what? Even though I don't believe like you do, but I'm kind of in awe of how persistent you are with your faith. You know that? It's really just this big part of your everyday life. And I also feel like as long as I've known you, I've seen you grow bit by bit, but steadily. I've seen you be consistent. I've seen you be real. I've seen you, be honest about when things weren't going well. I've seen you not chalk everything up to faith, but at the same time, I've also seen you just been down or going through things and at the same time hold on to your faith and find so much hope in that every day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I've seen you do that. And I got to be honest with you, I'm not sure I believe the same thing you do, but I absolutely respect what you believe because of what I've seen you do, because of how I see you live your life. You see, both the big changes and the small changes make a case for God's goodness. Our lives are meant to be living, breathing demonstrations of God. We are meant to plant seeds by sharing the gospel with anyone who will hear. And it's not up to us to worry too much about what happens while the seed is underground or to force someone's salvation. God will water what we sow. The most that we need to do still after we've sown the gospel is work the ground, so to speak, right? And make sure that we keep it fertile. And we do that by how we show up in the world and how we treat others so that they remain open to God because of how we treat them and because of how we represent Him. Lord, please help us to see the merit in our stories, to know that we cannot be counted out because you have already counted us in. Whatever our stories are, now that our lives are yours, let our stories be used for good and let them always testify of just how good you truly are. Amen.